So Joe Biden is now the president of the United States, which has turned off a lot of interesting predictions that happened across the Trumpian internet, especially with QAnon, who are many of the folks that actually stormed the Capitol in the last couple of weeks. Let's throw this up there on the screen. You basically saw some of the most, basically the collapse of this entire conspiracy within a couple of hours. Ron Watkins is one of the central players within QAnon saying, we gave it our all. Now we need to keep our chins up and get back to our lives as best we are able. Let's throw the Forbes tear sheet up there that we can see we all got played. QAnon followers implode after their big moment never comes, or in terms of Joe Biden not assuming the presidency. Many had talked about how they look stupid in front of their families or people in their jobs and how much they posted on social media. The next one, about Q being a LARP the entire time. There never was a plan. It's over. Nothing makes sense. Absolutely nothing. Now, look, it's easy to sit here and to dunk on these people and all of that. But I think I would prefer to say, look, what happened here? And what I think happened is that Trump, it was never really about Trump or anything that he stood for. It was a desperate longing for meaning, clearly, amongst millions of people to believe in some of hagiographic figure that's coming to save you and so much more. And I think that it speaks to something much deeper in terms of the rot that we have in our system. And we look back and you think about someone like Ashley Babbitt, the woman who was shot at the Capitol. And Eric Weinstein always talks about this. He's like, this woman was a veteran. She knew how firearms, she ran towards a gun because of QAnon and because of this belief in Trump, in these lies. And I think that this is something that we really need to grapple with the collapse of all of this, because look, Biden is president now, and you can say oh, it was a LARP, and the QAnon people are going to say, oh, it's over, etc. But you can't erase that type of conspiratorial thinking. And I've just been thinking a lot about Trump, the man himself, the figure, kind of how we should remember him, and especially in terms of remember him as a general person. Let's actually throw up C1E, the last element. I wasn't going to call it for currently, but Pedro Gonzalez, who's somebody really interesting, he said this: the problem with the Trump myth is good take is that myths, noble lies, are only as good as the realities that they create and serve. The myth of Trump in reality serves a grift. So perpetuating that myth instead of redefining it or making a new one is counterproductive. He talks about myths and reflects the point of unreal myths is to motivate people towards real goal. What real end does the myth of Trump as a savior serve? It's fleecing people of their time, emotions, and money for a president who pardons Democratic mega donors. I think Pedro is ultimately correct. And
Profound.
in terms of remembering Trump, and in terms of if there is such a thing as moving on for many of these people, I think it requires a lot of folks who have their trust. Probably not one of them at this point after we've been talking about Stop the Steal and more, but more broadly to say, look, you got played in many very important ways. At the end of the day, Trump's very last action as president was pardoning Jeanine Pirro's ex-husband for tax fraud. That's the definition of a grift. In terms of in the last things that he did as president, it was sowing distrust in the democratic process, giving false hope to millions who rightfully looked at him, rightfully or not, looked at him as a very important figure. And so now it's the first day that Trump is not president, for the first full day Trump is not president. I think we need to start having this conversation for the benefit of many of our fellow citizens who didn't realize the truth at the time.
So important of a point too about Jeanine Pirro, and you think too about Steve Bannon. Why was he in legal trouble? Because he literally ripped off Trump's own supporters and lied to them about. He said, we're not taking any compensation when he was taking significant compensation, and he gets a pardon. That kind of tells you everything about where the loyalties truly lie here. And I confess, I could not get enough of this content yesterday of, the QAnon meltdown. And people were like, oh my God, any moment, surely they're going to come and swarm in and Biden will never be president. And then the shock of what is actually happening. It actually went off and Trump left and what's going on right now. But the thing that has always really outraged me is that these people put their trust in Donald Trump and in other figures that aligned themselves with Trump. And that trust was completely and wildly abused. You are 100% correct. The fact that you could have people like Ashley Babbitt, who risked and in a few cases lost their lives over Donald J. Trump, and a complete, not only, and I keep saying this, not only was their cause not just, they didn't have a cause. Mm-hmm. It was completely invented, completely fabricated. That tells you there is something really sick going on in this society that deserves a much deeper conversation. By the way, one of the uncomfortable facts that I have heard very few talk about with regards to the Capitol riot is the fact that Ashley Babbitt had been an Obama supporter.
Yes.
Like, what do you do with that? And of course, you don't want to read too much into one individual person and their path, but we know there were a lot of people who voted for Obama and then were disenchanted and voted for Trump. How come there's no discussion going on like what happened there? You know, how did that path? What happened with that trajectory? What do we need to understand about what went wrong in that sense of disillusionment that would lead you to this completely insane place of believing in an utter conspiracy and fantasy that has no basis in reality, so much to the point that you put your life on the line, whether it's your literal life or, you know, your personal livelihood, people getting fired, cut off from their families, cut off from their friends, cut off from their employment and their ability to earn a living because of their belief in this utter delusion. That's a crazy state of affairs that represents a deeper rot in this society.
No, you're exactly right. And, you know, I actually reminded me just of this profile I just read in ProPublica, this guy named Kevin Gleason. I have it in front of me. Kevin Gleason died at the Capitol riots of a heart attack. In 2009, he traveled from Alabama to witness the inauguration of Barack Obama, quote, at the time, one of his political heroes. 12 years later, he died at the Capitol. And the heart attack, storming it after he had said on Parler, quote, let's take this effing country back, load your guns, and let's take to the streets. So what happened in the interim 12 years? Kevin was a union worker. His plant actually closed. He became increasingly disillusioned with the entire system. He saw in Trump, you know, somebody outside of the system who was coming in and could perhaps legitimately help his livelihood in his small Alabama town. He alienated a lot of people who were around him. And this is, again, you have to blame Trump. Trump, I mean, I'm not going to say he killed this man, but for Trump's lies, like Kevin would probably still be alive and would not have suffered the stress of having a heart attack on the steps of the Capitol. Why? What was the purpose of all of this? This is ultimately what Trump's real legacy would be, which is, you know, disillusioning, or not disillusioning, which is that taking advantage of a lot of vulnerable people in the United States, giving them false hope. And now I worry about, what does this sense of nihilism lead to? You know, QAnon was always such a weird conspiracy because it was aspirational. You know, most conspiracy theories are about something that already happened. This is like something that is going to happen, which is always really weird. And it's not really something more you see in like in cults in terms of what's going to happen. Now it didn't happen. So now what? I mean, are they just going to stop? And, you know, many of them said that. One guy even said that he dropped out of college and used his life savings to investigate election fraud. I mean, like, what is this man going to do? And I think about all these people, and look, we are all citizens. We all have to live in the same country. And I really just fear that it's going to lead to a bad place. And I also think that it's important, you know, for people like me or any others to say, look, this is on Trump, and we should remember him for what he did to a lot of different people. And we shouldn't hate the people who fell for this. We should say, we got to do something about this because, you know, they're citizens and they're, you know, our neighbors and everything else like that. Because otherwise, what's the alternative? It's just hating each other even more, which I think is terrible.
Yeah. And I think one of the things that I will have the hardest time getting over with regards to Trump is the fact that there were a lot of people who were struggling, who were vulnerable, who were looking for meaning, who gravitated to him, and he completely and thoroughly abused and misled them and lied to them straight up. Made them, you know, lose friends, family, relationships, in certain cases, their lives. It's truly unforgivable. I mean, it really is. To take someone who's like in a place of need and use and abuse them in that way is truly and utterly disgusting. I mean, it is very reminiscent of the whole Trump University scheme, which I always thought was probably the worst scandal that was unearthed about Trump coming into office, that you would take these people who were desperate, working class, and get them to put, you know, take out more debt on their credit cards to pay for more courses that aren't ultimately going to get them anywhere, leading them into greater financial distress and ruin. That type of abuse of trust is one of the most disgusting things that you can possibly do. And that's ultimately the real culprit here and where the real culpability lies. The last thing I wanted to say is I think the point that you pulled about mythology is a really interesting and profound one, because it's true. Human beings have always relied on storytelling, mythology. If you look across cultures, there's a lot of sort of similar threads in the mythology that, across cultures, across times, across different civilizations. It's a really sort of deep longing to put everything into context and in a story and have meaning around it. And that's not a bad thing, even when sometimes that mythology isn't exactly true to real life. So if you had a myth around Trump or a myth around another political figure that was in service of a greater good, that actually built towards something, you could look at that with a more favorable view. But this ultimately led to nothing other than Steve Bannon getting a pardon and people cashing in and a whole enterprise of grift and power and proximity to power. That was just, it really was like a sort of pyramid scheme of using the very people who were the greatest believers and in the most distress.
Yeah, no, that's right. The myth of Trump to me is that the system is so bad that people would elect this moron to be president of the United States. That's it. Maybe that's enough. I don't know why that's not enough. And I hope that that's one that we'll take forward in the future. It's been a great discussion, and we're going to have more Rising for everybody right after this.